Good afternoon, everyone. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Koch. He was a professor at Caltech for, I think, 25 years almost. And a few years ago, he was persuaded to leave sunny California and move up to Seattle to head the Allen Brain Institute, which has been doing phenomenal work in the neuroscience area. Christoph is well known for his work in consciousness, which traditionally has been deemed beyond the scope of science. And I think he's been making great progress into showing that science can actually help unveil this mystery. So with that, let's learn more from Christoph.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. So unfortunately, I'm not a professor anymore. I'm not a tenured. I cannot leap tall buildings 90 feet tall buildings in a single leap anymore. Just a regular guy. The CSO at the Allen Institute for Brain Science. We are a non-for-profit institute, roughly 300 people going to 500, focused on two very large brain projects based on trying to explore the mouse brain, particular cortex, and the human cortex, but I won't talk about that. I'll talk about my other passion, which is consciousness. I'll divide the tutorial in two parts. The shorter part is early on, sort of easier going, tells you something about the experimental approach that people are taking to the problem of discovering the material causes of consciousness. The second part, which is going to be a little bit heavier going because it's much more math, is based on a theory, to my mind, the only sort of semi-coherent theory of consciousness that tries to address the fundamental problem of consciousness, which is to understand what type of physical systems under which condition can give rise to conscious experience. So if you want a popular account, you can read this book on the left, MIT Press. If you are more interested in the broad implications of it, you can read that X-Archive. If you want all the gory, particularly the mathematical details, then you have to look at that Tononi paper on peerless computational biology, plus all of its appendices. So with this topic, you had to, 20 or 30 years ago, when I first talked about consciousness, you had to give sort of a half an hour preamble to explain to people why you're not a mystic, why you're not crazy, why you're not religious, while as a scientist, not only do I want to study consciousness, but you have to study consciousness. Since consciousness is the only thing we have direct acquaintance with. That's the term philosophers use. And this is really the heart of the most famous deduction in Western thought 380 years ago by René Descartes, je pense donc je suis. What he meant by that, and that is still as valid today as it was then, is the only thing, I can doubt everything. I can doubt the existence of the world. I can doubt the existence of my body. I can certainly doubt the exact character of my perception. We know there's a very large number of illusions. But what I cannot doubt, what is beyond any doubt, that's the only thing René Descartes concluded he was certain of, is the fact that he exists because he's conscious. He has conscious experience. He sees something, he feels something. Fundamentally, he experiences something. That's what consciousness is about. It's about subjective experience. The fact that right now, you hear my voice in your head, you have a picture in your head, there's a movie of your life, you smell things, you have pains, you have pleasures, you can introspect that you're a man, that one day you're going to die. All those things you can do because you have conscious experience, you have conscious awareness, you have subjective phenomenology. These are all different terms that describe the same thing. It feels like something to be conscious. When you're in a deep sleep, or when you're anesthetized, or when you're in coma, it doesn't feel like anything. You may as well be dead. But in normal life, like right now, or tonight, in the privacy of your head, when you go to sleep, your brain will wake up while your body sleeps, and you'll also have conscious states. We call those dreams. Those are all different conscious states. And the central mystery throughout the ages, since probably 2,000 years since Aristotle and Plato first thought about this problem, is how does the physical world, including my brain, which is a physical object like any other object, how does the physical world relate to this subjective world? In particular, what's troubling, if you look at the foundational equation of physics, quantum mechanics and general relativity, there's no mention of conscious experience. If you look at the periodic table of chemistry, you know, the 92 elements that are on Earth here, there's nothing there about consciousness. If you look at the endless ATGC chatter of our genes, there's nothing there about consciousness. Yet we find ourselves in a world where we have conscious experiences. And the challenge is to account for that. And the claim of what I'm going to talk about today is that consciousness ultimately arises because of a particular form of complexity, because of integrated information. That any piece of highly organized matter, such as our brain, which is certainly the most complex piece of highly organized matter in the known universe, that any piece of organized matter has conscious experiences associated with it. That we live in a world where highly organized pieces of matter, like my brain, like your brain, like the brains of animals, and possible like the brains of machines, do have conscious experience associated with them, that it feels like something to be these different systems. All right. Well, usually at this point I call for dimming of the room lights, but I think that's going to be difficult here, right? Yeah. All right, so this is just one of innumerable illusions, because I don't want to start this investigation by defining things rigorously. That's not, if you look at it historically, science never proceeds that way. It has an operational definition. So here the point of this illusion is that you may see very faint because the room lights, you can see blue clouds, some dots. So in a dark, what you see a vivid sphere of blue dots, and then you see the two yellow squares. And when you keep your eyes steady, for example, when you keep your eyes fixated on the lower fixation course on the bottom or the fixation course in the middle, that one or two of those yellow squares will disappear. They will not be there. Although physically, of course, they're there all the time on the screen. The photons with the appropriate wavelengths will always strike your retina, but something happens, some dynamic process in your brain, and sometimes you will see them, sometimes you will not. But if you keep your eyes very steady, these yellow squares they may disappear for 5 or 10 seconds. It's called motion-induced blindness. What it shows, and there are many illusions of this character, is that sometimes you see something and sometimes you don't, although the same retinal input impinges onto your brain, right? So somewhere in the catacombs of the brain, there's a process that gives rise to a conscious sensation. You actually see yellow squares. They remind you of other yellow things that you've seen previously, and sometimes they don't. And the question that Francis Crick, with whom I worked for many years, Francis Crick and I first set out, where's the difference in your brain between when you see yellow and when you don't see yellow? Now, you might think that this is inconsequential, seeing yellow. What's a big deal? Isn't consciousness really about self-consciousness and reflecting upon myself? But all the evidence suggests that self-consciousness, something we're particularly proud of, particularly if we are adult and we are highly literary, because children, in particular infants, have very little of it, it's just a later evolutionary adaptation of consciousness. It's consciousness reflecting upon itself. You have a complicated system, it has its own representation, begins to reflect upon itself, and that's what self-consciousness is. But much more widespread is just any conscious sensation, whether it's about me, self-consciousness, or about the world out there, or because I have toothache, or I see red, or I think of my mom. Those are all different conscious experiences. And the claim is that once we understand the neuronal, and more general, the physical basis or the conceptual basis for this sort of consciousness, then we will have solved the heart of the mind-body problem. So this is a mind-body problem, and the person who really also wrote very clear about it was Gottfried Leibniz, who of course co-invented calculus and invented the binary system. And he had some very interesting things to say about it, and he makes, in his famous monadology he wrote towards the end of his life, he has this famous example of a mill where you essentially says, well, if you look in the brain and you amplify the brain just like a mill, you walk inside, all you see the gears and levers, but where's consciousness? Today this is known as a heart problem. It's been popularized by the philosopher David Chalmers, but it really goes back to many centuries before. Now, in general, when philosophers tell you science can't do something, of course, historically they've been wrong so far at least. And so just disregard them. Historically, they don't have a very good track record of predicting things. So there's a conceptual distinction here I'd like to make between two different forms that we use of consciousness. There's one content of consciousness, and then there are states of consciousness. They're related, but they're different. So most philosophers and scientists and people in general care about the content of consciousness. How does that come about? So right now, your content should be filled with my voice. Or, if you you may remember something, or you think looking forward to the next talk, then your content of consciousness is filled with something else. That's different with states, from states of consciousness. Right now, you're hopefully all still awake. If what I say bores you, you're going to go into a sleep, which is a different state. I mentioned already earlier yet another state, which is a type of state where sleep, where the brain actually wakes up and you have conscious experiences, dreams. So those are things that we go through on a diurnal rhythm, awake, sleep, and then REM sleep, non-REM sleep. But then there are also, of course, pathological states of consciousness. If you, like this lady, some of you may remember her, Terry Schiavo. She's just one of roughly 10,000 such patients who's in what's called a PVS, a permanent or persistent vegetative state, where she has sleep-wake transitions, but there's no, as far as people, clinical personnel can tell, there's no conscious awareness. It's sort of it's all brainstem reflexes. The patient will occasionally move her eyes or grimace or sort of moan, but there's no way to interact with her in any purposeful manner. And we know a lot about the clinical basis of these states of pathological unconsciousness. But they're different from the content of consciousness, which is really the key problem. So we know there are certain parts of the brain that are necessary for you to have any conscious experience at all, particular midline structures. If you don't have them, you're in coma. But the question is, how does the content come about? And the content provider is really cortex and associated structures like the thalamus and the claustrum. So as I said, if you're conscious of pain or pleasure or seeing red or remembering something, all of that content is provided by the cortical sheet. 16 billion neurons in us. What can we say about consciousness for sure? There are many things we know already about consciousness. So for example, we know consciousness is associated with certain types of complex adaptive biological networks, namely the brain, usually at least, in a healthy individual. Now, mind you, there are other networks in the body that do not have consciousness associated with them, and we don't really understand why. There's, for example, the immune system, which are actually several systems, an acquired immune system and an innate one. And your immune system will remember things, right? So we all traveled here to Montreal. For most of us, it's a different immune environment than the one we left this morning or yesterday. And so our body may right now be busy, our immune system may now be busy fighting off some virus that's prevalent here in Montreal. But you have no feeling for that. Your immune system does it all silently. You have no conscious access to that. Why is that? And it has even memory, because once it building up immunity means you have an antibody against it. So something in your body, in your immune system, will remember. And we know a lot about the cellular basis of that. There's another nervous system inside your body. It's here inside the gut, so-called the enteric nervous system. Contains on the order of 100 million neurons, so as many neurons as there are, let's say, in a mouse. But as far as we can tell, that system isn't conscious. And if you feel, for example, full or disintended, or you're nauseated, it's actually not down here. We know the activity that gives rise to all those bodily feelings are centered in a particular part of the cortex called the insula. So again, the question is why the nervous system here has neurons and it has neurotransmitters. Why is it not giving rise to consciousness? We don't know. We know that consciousness doesn't require behavior. As I mentioned this already twice, the dream state. In the dream state, to prevent you, presumably to prevent your body from acting out your dreams, there is a central ataxia. There's a central paralysis that's instituted by your brain when you sleep and have these vivid experiences of running or fighting or other things. In some people, that inhibition is incomplete, and then they have all sorts of pathological disturbances and parasomnias. There are also clinical cases where people have cataplexy, complete, or catatony, complete inability to move, yet they're fully conscious. For instance, the famous MPTP patients. We know, again from the clinic, that consciousness doesn't require emotion. Although emotions are, of course, terribly important for our conscious life, both the positive and negative emotions, and dysregulation of emotion, particularly of the sort you see in the DSM-5, in all sorts of mental diseases, are profound source of anguish. But you have patients, for example, people from, soldiers that returned from Afghanistan or Iraq. A bomb has blown off their legs and has partly injured their brain. Their life has changed forever, but if you talk to them, they have this totally flat affect. They have no affect anymore. They don't express particular dismay that that for the rest of their life they're confined to a wheelchair. But they clearly still see and feel pain and pleasure, etc. But they just don't have the emotions anymore because the explosion took away some of the structures that mediate those sorts of emotions. So yes, for normal life you need emotion. Of course, you need behavior. But like anywhere in science, in order to isolate and really understand phenomena, you want to isolate it and really drill in on the core phenomena at hand. There's much research now showing that attention can be dissociated from consciousness. It used to be thought until recently that if you attend to something, so let's say I attend to a friend over there in the audience, then typically I will become conscious of them. That is true. I can attend to a voice and become conscious of the voice. Yet you can now also show, and there are more than 40 experiments that have shown this now, that you can attend to things that are perceptually invisible, that you don't see, which is counterintuitive, but psychologists have done this. There's some beautiful experiments to show that you can look at things, your brain can process things, but you don't see them. And so that shows you that attention is, that attention does not automatically lead to conscious awareness. Whether or not you can attend, or whether or not you become conscious of something without attention, that's still an open experimental question. But certainly you get this one-way dissociation. We know consciousness doesn't require language. We know it doesn't because little children, infants and children, of course, are pre-linguistic competent, yet they appear to be conscious. And of course, a patient who's aphasic due to stroke is still conscious. Same thing with self-consciousness, as I mentioned before. Particular people who write books about consciousness, they tend to be very literary and they love exploring their own self-consciousness, which sometimes has pathological consequences. But if you are engaged out there in the world, so I'm a rock climber. If you're on the sharp end of a rope, then everything else will recede. The inner voice, that inner critic, constantly accompanies you and criticizes you at all points in time. It's totally gone, totally shut off by the intensity of the task and by the urgency of the task at hand. If you weave at a bike at high speed through traffic, if you're watching an engaging movie or reading an engaging book, if you're making love, in all those cases you're fully engaged with the world, you're highly conscious, but you have very little consciousness of self. We also know this from patient and from functional brain imaging. There's no question that in us it's highly developed. In fact, that's probably the singular most greatest differences between us and other animals, that we have a highly developed self-consciousness, particularly adult Homo sapiens has highly developed self-consciousness, which is present only in a much reduced way in animals. We know this through tests like the mirror test. And we know, of course, you're all familiar with lots of patients who have lost some or all of their long-term memory, but who still have pains and pleasures, who can still see and feel. So we know that long-term memory is not required. We also know from split brain experiments done by Roger Sperry at Caltech that consciousness can occur in one single cerebral hemisphere. In fact, all the evidence suggests that if I take one of you and surgically disconnect your 200 million fibers, the corpus callosum that connects your left hemisphere with your right hemisphere, all the evidence suggests that then there will be two conscious entities in one skull. One, typically the one on the left, has access to language and so can talk about his or her experiences. And so if you talk to the patient, to the individual, you'll talk to her or his left hemisphere. But there's also another conscious entity in the right hemisphere that's typically mute. Early on, after such a split brain experiment, you can get this dissociation where one hand, will open, will dress, and the other hand will undress. Typically, that subside. And there are other ways to probe. For example, you can silence the left hemisphere by injecting sodium amytal. You can essentially anesthetize it, and then you can sort of query the right hemisphere. So we know under these conditions, when you cut those fibers, a lot of them, 200 million, that you can get two conscious entity in one head. There's a great American novel there to be written about that. And we know from 150 years of neurology, some of you will have read the books of Oliver Sacks, he describes this in great detail. We know through 150 years of clinical neurology that specific lesions in your head, specifically in your cerebral cortex and in its associated satellite in the thalamus, give rise to specific loss of content of consciousness. So for example, you may have a rare lesion in which you're unable to see motion, the cortical lesion, in which you can see things far away and close by like a strobe light, but you don't have a sense of motion anymore. Or there's another cortical lesion that you lose the sense of color, achromatopsia. It's nothing to do with the eyes. The eyes are perfectly functioning. It's central part of the brain. Or you can lose, for example, the feeling of familiarity with a place or with an individual. So after the stroke that destroyed part of your brain, you will insist that your wife, although she looks like she always did, she smells and talks like she always did, is an alien. She's an imposter. She's not your wife anymore. You just know it. Why? Because you've lost this feeling of familiarity, and it's very jarring because of the lesion. So once again, there's a lot of evidence that it's cortex that provides the specific content. Now, of course, we know, certainly since Nietzsche and Sigmund Freud studied this in depth, that many, in fact, it's quite possible that most of our behavior, depending on what you call behavior, is actually done in the absence of any conscious sensation. So I'm talking about all the stuff that you do almost throughout your entire day that you don't notice. You constantly, particularly here on busy streets in downtown Montreal when there are lots of shoppers, you constantly have to adjust your body posture. You constantly have to adjust your hand all the time. You move your head, you move your eyes, and beautiful experiments show you can do all of that without conscious awareness. Yes, I can, of course, be conscious of my eye movements, but that's a very small fraction of time. And you can show, very nice operationally, that you can move your eyes much finer, at a much finer level of granularity than what you have conscious access to. In other words, the control system, the servo systems of your eyes they have access to better spatial temporal granularity than what you consciously see. Any overtrained routines that we do all the time, shaving, tying our shoelaces, playing video games, tennis, typing, right? Something that we do 8 or 10 hours a day now, right? Is highly, highly overtrained, and beautiful experiments have shown that if you try to attend to what you're doing, or if you become conscious of it really while you're doing it, it slows down your performance tremendously and you make many, many more mistakes. What happened in these cases is that, of course, early on when you first learned how to type in your distal childhood, you had to be highly conscious of it. But then in a sense what happens, that very likely involves cortex, then essentially you download it on parts of your brain known as the basal ganglia, the stratum, and that looks like it executes these things flawless, effortlessly, without any conscious sensation. But that only works for highly overtrained routines. And of course, those things are important, for example, in sports, right? In climbing or in playing tennis, that's what you want to do. That's why you train day in, day out. You train sort of your unconscious zombie so you can execute these movements without thinking about it. You need consciousness to plan, to stitch all the different things together, right? To plan a route when you think, first I'm going to do this and that and that. But then when you execute it very smoothly, your body does it. And so this gives rise to a question, or several questions. One is, where's the difference in the brain between all the things that give rise to consciousness and all those unconscious things? So people have defined two terms, BCC and NCC. So BCC are the behavioral correlates of consciousness. How do I know that an organism, whether it's an adult, volunteer, typically an undergraduate in a lab, how do I know they're conscious? Well, you can just ask her. If she tells you, yeah, I saw red, or I saw a female face flashing on the screen, then you typically assume that she's conscious. Now, you have to use other tests when people can't tell you that, either because they don't talk your language, or more relevant, because they're children or they're infants. And people, of course, do lots of experiments with infants, so there you can't directly test them. Talk to them, you have to look for other means, like what do they pay attention to? Where do they move their eyes? How long do they stare at things? Or same thing with patients who can't talk. And of course, then you have to use the similar criteria if you're dealing with non-human animals, right? So if you're dealing, for example, with monkeys, they can never talk to you. So there, people have invented methods, metrics, that where the monkey using a button or push button or lever can indicate its behavior. And if you, for example, in visual neuroscience, there's beautiful curves of experiments of the last 100 years showing very nicely that properly trained undergrads and monkeys see exactly the same. If you ask them not linguistic things, but if you ask them perception of faces or perception of color or stereo or depth or things like that, it's really very, very similar. And so we infer that because the monkey, if it's a healthy monkey and the monkey has the same behavior as a person, that the monkey also sees something. And all the evidence seems to suggest that. So typically, these BCC becomes relevant when you're dealing, as I said, with non-human animals and particularly with severely injured. So these are particularly relevant for emergency room personnel. So, there's an accident, you have the EMT brings in a patient who's unable to talk to you, right, because he's been horribly injured. Well, how do you know he's conscious? So typically you ask him to, can he talk at all? You assess how much does he control his eyes, how much can he control any limb? So there's a thing called as a Glasgow coma scale, so you can assess to what extent severely injured patients are conscious. Typically, as I said, for humans, for normal humans, it's meaningful linguistic content. In general, for humans or for non-human animals, it's associated with any non-stereotyped temporal delay motor behavior. For instance, you see something, you wait 10 seconds, and then you replicate it, that sort of thing. That's sort of typically associated with conscious sensation. And then people study, in particular, the neuronal correlates of consciousness. So this is something that Francis Crick, the guy who found the double helix with Jim Watson, in his last 25 years of his life, he shifted his focus from molecules to the mind. And I was fortunate enough to work with him for 16 years. And we defined these neuronal correlates of consciousness as the minimal neuronal mechanisms that are jointly sufficient for any one conscious percept. So if you saw those yellow squares, then the question is, what is the minimal set of neurons in your head that gives rise to those yellow squares? And by definition, if I have identified those NCC and I remove them or I inactivate them by doing some sort of interfering, by doing TMS or current stimulation during surgery or using some fancy optogenetic technique, then the claim would be if these are the true NCC, the person will not see yellow squares anymore. And if I induce the NCC, but for example, again, inducing it by microelectrode, by electrically stimulating, as sometimes you can do during neurosurgery, then the patient should see whatever's associated with that, in this case, the yellow squares. And then you can also ask, well, where's the difference, the NCC for yellow squares and for blue dots, or for seeing my face? Do they all involve similar neurons in the visual system? Or is there something common about the way they fire? Maybe they all oscillate, maybe they are all synchronous, maybe they're all located in a particular layer, maybe they're all labeled by a particular molecular promoter. Those are all different hypotheses people have entertained. And where's the difference between visual NCC and auditory NCC? When you hear something, when you see something, or when you smell something, or when you remember something, is there something common? Do they all involve the same type of consciousness neurons, or the same type of special signal? So those are questions you can ask. And you can reduce them to causal questions. This is not only observational, but causal in a sense of Pearl, causality, because we now have the tools. They're still very primitive in humans, but we're beginning to have very sophisticated tools in animals where we can intervene delicately, deliberately, transiently, with millisecond precision in specific groups of neurons using optogenetics. So we can begin to get at these questions in a causal way. And then, of course, what we want to do, we want to move from the behavioral correlates of consciousness to the neural correlates of consciousness. So this is a classical experiment done by Giulio Tononi. Here you have a subject, a healthy volunteer. You put him in a setup where the two different eyes are stimulated on the left, let's say, by a horizontally moving red square, in the right by a vertically moving blue square. If you do things correctly, what you'll see, you experience something known as binocular rivalry. Binocular because you have two eyes and the rival is the stimulus if they overlap. So rather than seeing an overlap, a checkerboard of red and green, what you'll only see the red for a while and moving horizontally. And then the red will sort of disappear and be replaced by the blue moving vertically. And then again, you see the red horizontally. You have this never-ending dance. But the physical stimulus is always the same. So now you can correlate the behavioral correlate when he says, I see red, I don't see red, or I see red, I see blue. And then you can correlate, well, where's the difference in the brain when he sees red and when he sees blue? Right, and here there were some specific differences that they identified using magnetic encephalography. So I just want to outline this in broad strokes. So you can ask, well, what part of the brain can we say for certain could be potential NCCs? So if we stick with vision, and I would say 95% of all the research has been done in vision, we know it's not the retina. And we know this since the 19th century. Essentially, the character of your retinal ganglion cells, the character of neurons in your eyes is very different from what you actually see. So for instance, you probably all know we move our eyes between 3 to 4 times a second. We are pretty much completely oblivious to that. In fact, we cannot see our eyes move. So if you look in a bathroom mirror, so if one of you can clearly see my eyes move, no problem. But if I look at myself in the mirror, I cannot see my own eyes move, because what happens as my eyes move, my brain shuts down during that brief period of 50 or 60 milliseconds. And then it interpolates, it splices in. It's like in a Hollywood cutting editing process. It suggests that I saw here and then I moved here. It also moved all the sense of motion, right? If you take your iPhone and move it at the same cadence as you move your eyes, you would get nauseated by these whole fields. Well, we don't have that because our brain edits all of that out. You may also remember from school that you have a blind spot, a point where the retinal wiring, the optic nerve, leaves the eye disc, and given the geometry of our eyes, there are no photoreceptors there. So there's one point in this eye, there's a whole region in this eye that doesn't get any visual input. Same thing with this eye. But even if I close the other eye that can compensate for it, I don't see any hole. Right? And you can do, you have to do this test to indirectly infer it. Why? Well, because the brain interpolates the information, the missing information at the blind spot is cleverly interpolated by our brain. We have no color in the periphery, although it looks colored. So there are all sorts of things that the retina represents that isn't represented in our conscious perception. Yet, of course, for normal seeing, the information has to flow through the eye, but it's not the eye that gives rise to the sense of conscious sensation. We also know this through imagery. I can close my eyes. I can still imagine the audience out there. And of course, tonight, once again, I'm going to dream. And for the vast majority of us, our dreams are highly visual. And of course, we don't, it's dark and the eyes are closed, yet we still have very vivid visual conscious sensations. So we know it has to be higher up. This was a surprising finding to the neurologist. This is the brain of a healthy 24-year-old Chinese lady. She has some speech impediments and she has some slight motor ataxia, but otherwise she's normal. And she had to go to the hospital for some secondary reason and get this brain scan, when the neurologist discovered that she has absolutely no cerebellum. She has no cerebellum whatsoever. She's one of the very rare cases of agenesis of the cerebellum. So some of us are born without certain brain structures. Like there's 1 out of 1,000 people who is born without a corpus callosum, and there's a much smaller fraction of people who are born without the cerebellum. As I said, it took her 7 years to learn how to walk. She has some speech. She can speak, but she has some impediment. We know there are roughly 86 billion neurons in the human brain, or at least in the brain of 4 elder Brazilian men. And 69 billion, 4 out of 5 of all neurons in your brain are in the cerebellum. And they're gone here. So she only has 16, roughly, she has 16 billion neurons rather than 86. Yet there's nothing wrong with her consciousness. She has experiences, she can talk about them, no problem whatsoever. In fact, it's been known for a while now that if you have a lesion or stroke or tumor in your cerebellum, you will have difficulty, you may look like you're drunk, you may, stagger, you slur your speech, etc. You lack fine motor control, but there's nothing wrong with your conscious experiences. So we have to ask, and we need a theory that explains, well, what is it about the cerebellum? It has neurons, a ton of them, as I said, more than any place else in the brain. It has synapses, it has action potential, neurotransmitters, all the stuff you expect of a decent brain. And somehow it doesn't give rise to consciousness. So it's an interesting challenge. We know this is based on a hypothesis Francis Crick and I made. At the time we said consciousness, the NCC, it doesn't reside in primary visual cortex. So the primary cortical areas are the areas that are the direct recipient of sensory information. So there's a primary visual area, there's a primary auditory area, there's a primary somatosensory area. The current evidence suggests that none of those areas give directly rise to conscious sensation, that conscious sensation happens in higher regions. For example, just to give you a flavor of an experiment that people do now, the typical design, it's a so-called 2-by-2 design, where you manipulate, as I mentioned before, attention and consciousness. So here, this is done Watanabe in the lab of Nikos Logotitis in Germany. On the vertical axis, you manipulate attention. On the horizontal axis, you manipulate consciousness, to what extent the stimulus is visible. So the stimulus is in the center, it's a grating. And physically, on the monitor, the grating is always present. But sometimes, because you manipulate, you have a masking stimulus. You see the grating, like in the left column. And sometimes you don't see the grating on the right column. So it's just not there. Though physically it's there, you just do not perceive it. You're not conscious of it. That's an simple operational test. Do you see it? You ask people to push a button. Do they see it or do they not see it? And then here we manipulate attention. So either in the top row, the attention is paid to the peripheral letters. You know, there's this annular stimulus, and you either pay attention to there's a stream of letter there, and you have to answer something about that stream of letter. Or in the bottom row, the same stream of letter, but you pay attention to the grating. So this is how you manipulate spatial attention, and this is how you manipulate consciousness. And then you do standard fMRI, like people do now since 25 years. You put people in a scanner. This experiment has also been done in monkeys, but here it's done with people. Here you see the result for 2 subjects, and you look at purely their hemodynamics. In other words, you look at the neuronal response, but only in primary visual cortex. And there are 4 conditions, right, the 4 quadrant, and then you segregate them for one patient for the other patient. Subjects, sorry, these are normal subjects. And what you see, whether you attend or not attend, that makes a big difference to the response there. So when you attend, typically the response is twice as high as when you not attend. Whether or not the subject saw the stimulus made no difference to the fMRI response there. So this is some of the evidence that leads people to think that you're not conscious of activity in primary visual cortex. There are some beautiful experiments now where people they don't only do this correlation, but they actually can begin to move from correlation to causation using electrical stimulation. In this case, it just came out of a study from Stanford where people have identified. So here you're looking at the brain from below. So think of the body. This is the way neurologists view it from up. So the right is on the left side here, and it's the underside of your brain. The cerebellum normally sits on there, has been removed. And this is a so-called fusiform gyrus, and in hot colors is indicated the regions typically called FFA, fusiform phase area. Those are typically the regions that respond to phases, either as measured by functional brain imaging, fMRI, or as measured by evoked potential. So both on the left and the right you have these regions, here and here roughly, above your cerebellum, bilateral, that are triggered by that respond much more strongly to phases than to scrambled phases, or they respond stronger to phases than to houses or things like that. Now they stimulate either on the left or on the right, and ask the patient, as the electrode is inserted, what the patient sees. You can just directly talk to them. And the patient sees changes, distortion in phases, pretty routinely, but only if the right FFA is stimulated, not if the left is stimulated. So it tells you this is why neuroscientists constantly say, constantly preach correlation isn't causation. So yes, both left and right areas respond much stronger to phases than to non-phases, but in fact only the right one gives rise to the conscious, or interferes with the conscious perception of a phase. This is my favorite structure that you've never heard of. It's called the claustrum. Okay, we all have it. We have 2 of them, one left, one right. This is in a monkey. It's a sheet-like structure, yay big. It's one here and one here, underneath the cortex, but above the basal ganglia. It's very thin. So it's difficult to see on fMRI. And there are no lesions because it's supplied by 2 arteries. So you almost never find it lesioned. But it's a structure together with the thalamus that's really connected with all the different cortical regions. It's like grand central. Francis Crick and I, so that's Francis Crick and a younger me, on the day he passed away, we'd worked, in fact, in the hospital on the day he passed away, he'd still worked on a manuscript about the claustrum that subsequently came out. Because the claustrum is a fascinating structure. As I said, it connects to all parts of the brain, but it gets input as well it goes back to all parts of the brain, of cortex. So it looks like it could act sort of as a conductor of the cortical symphony. And so we made this classical structure-function relationship, just like Francis early on in his life did with Jim Watson with the double helix, and said, well, there's this unique structure, and we think it has a unique function associated with consciousness. It integrates all the different cortical regions that carry different color, motion, auditory, motor information into a single coherent concept. This was 10 years ago. This paper with this one case study comes out just a couple of months ago. Now, of course, one has to be very skeptical. It's one patient, one. So this is, it's an interesting anecdote, that's all it is right now, where we know from, just to step back a little bit, we know from 120 years of cortical stimulation, if your cortex is stimulated, let's say during surgery, one of several things will happen. Usually nothing will happen. So usually if you stimulate at the currents that doctors do stimulate, nothing. I mean, the person doesn't feel anything, doesn't hear anything, nothing. Sometimes, depending where you stimulate, you'll get a sensation. Typically, it's a body sensation. You'll feel some weird feeling. If it's in motor cortex, of course, you twitch the contralateral, the other side. In visual cortex, sometimes you can get flashes of light. In higher order areas, medial temporal lobe, sometimes you can get specific memories. You can get the same memories, it's a single discrete memory with your grandma when you went into the cathedral. And you stimulate again, and again you get this very specific memory. Here what they found in a patient, the patient goes into the zombie state. It's really very interesting. They do this day 1 and day 2, and every time they stimulate, and for as long as they stimulate, the patient stares ahead. When she says a simple word like 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, she continues to say it, but sort of it drops off. When she does a single gesture and you stimulate, it drops off, and she just stares ahead. She has no memory whatsoever for the intervening stimulation period. It doesn't give rise to an epileptic seizure. You can see that. So many people are now trying to replicate this in animals, since you can't wait for another such lesion 100 years, plus it's a patient, you can't manipulate them really. For obviously ethical reasons, people are trying to reproduce this experiment now in animals. All right, so let's skip all of this. So over the last 25 years, since the modern exploration of consciousness, people have focused in on the regions that are directly associated or have a more strategic relationship to consciousness than other regions that you can lose or that are not active during conscious sensation. And so we know it seems to be cortex, but it's not any cortical areas, it's specific parts of the cortex. Which exact area is controversial and is not sort of relevant here. But sort of we've chased some of the correlates down to particular region of the brain. Now, of course, this is not the end, because it's not regions of the brain that give rise to conscious sensation. It's nerve cells. We believe all the evidence suggests that the atoms of perception, the atoms of behavior, the atoms of consciousness are neurons, nerve cells, and their incredible complex connection. 10 to the 11 neurons and 10 to the 14 or 10 to the 15 synapses in the human brain. Just like in order to understand chemistry, we need to know about the outer valence electrodes and how they interact with each other. To understand anything about the brain in health, or in pathological brains like schizophrenia, depression, autism, etc., we need to know about neurons and how they interact with each other. So we need to chase down consciousness towards the neural networks, and that's sort of an ongoing project. It's an ongoing project, particularly in other non-human species. So these are 2 mammals, 2 females, my daughter and her German Shepherd. I think certainly, and most people, certainly all biologists would believe that both are conscious. One can talk about it. The other one can talk about it indirectly through her behavior. She wags her tail. She has different sorts of barks, right? If you around dogs, you know, they have a great variety of different barks. They can express different sentiments. Their brain architecture is remarkably similar. So the behaviors are not the same, but are similar. The brain architecture are very similar. They're both mammals. In fact, mammals are defined by the existence of a cerebral cortex, one of the defining features. And of course, we know we are all closely related within, in this case, 60 million years. The main specialization that we have is a highly developed, some say an overdeveloped sense of consciousness and sense of importance. That's really what distinguishes us from other animals. If you look at the brain, particularly if you remove the scale bar, so if you look at cortex, so cortex itself is a sheet, right? You probably know that. It's a tissue. I call it a 2 plus epsilon dimensional computational tissue. 2 plus epsilon, since across the mammals, it's changed, the width has changed only by factor 2 or 3. So in a mouse, it's maybe 900 micrometer thick. In a human, it's 2 to 3 millimeter thick. But in a mouse, it's less than a square centimeter. In us, it's more like 1,200 square centimeter, one hemisphere. So think of it like a pizza. The cortex is pretty much like a pizza. It's 2 to 3 millimeter thick. And it's, of course, highly rolled up, and you've got 2 of these pizza sheets. And it's relatively homogeneous. It's not the same everywhere. There are differences between here and here and here, but first order is all the same, has the same genes expressed, same very similar transcriptomics, transcriptional architecture. And the same thing is true not only in my brain, in all our brain, but also if you go to brains of other mammals. So one of these brains is a mouse brain, the other one is a human brain. I've removed the scale bar, and so once I've done that, they really look very similar. And if you look at the neurons, the underlying synapses, the neurotransmitter, they're all the same. And I've recorded over the last 20 years single neurons from a human brain. We do it routinely now at the Allen Institute. Human brains, mouse brain, they behave very, very similar. Human brains are a little bit bigger. Human neurons are a little bit bigger. There's a general scaling factor. The bigger the animal, the bigger the neurons. But of course, it's not the biggest brain, right? Elephants, dolphins, whales have much bigger brains than we do. Elephants have 264 billion neurons compared to our 86 billion. So it's probably the size and the total number of neurons in cortex that makes a difference. That's the biggest difference between us and other mammals. But that's a hypothesis that remains to be tested. All right, so now I'm going to switch gears because this is all cool, and this is ongoing. There's lots of neuroscience going on, and it's filling all the right journals, Nature, Science, etc., with these sort of discovery. But that leaves open a whole bunch of questions that this purely empirical-driven exploration cannot answer. In fact, you can go back to René Descartes, father of modern science by one measure, right? Because he, of course, identified famously the soul, the heart of conscience, that was his language, as a pineal gland. And we can all laugh about it and say, well, isn't that ridiculous? Well, actually, he was a breath, because he came after the medieval philosophers who were all worried about final causes. You know, they're all Aristotelian. And he, in totally modern scientists, looked for a structure-function association. He realized that I have only one conscious experience, normally, leaving aside split brain patient that he didn't know, of course. There's only one me. It's a unity of consciousness. It's the fact that everybody has remarked upon for the last thousands of years. Any conscious experience is unitary, it's holistic, it's integrated. Well, then he asked, but in the brain, he did actually dissection there. There's 2 of everything. There are 2 cerebral cortices, there are 2 cerebella. So since there's only one conscious sensation, there has to be a single unitary structure. And the only unitary structure he could identify at the time, giving his techniques, was the pineal gland. And also erroneously, it was thought that if you lose pineal gland, you die. So that's why he made that association. Now today, of course, we are much more cleverer, and we can say, well, it's certain regions of high-level cortex that involve pyramidal cells oscillating at 40 hertz sitting in layer 5. But in both cases, both pineal gland and this much more complicated, sophisticated hypothesis, I have to ask, well, why that structure? Why does that structure give rise to conscious sensation, not some other? Why is the claustrum involved? Why not the cerebellum? Why not afferent pathways like the retina or the spinal cord? What is it about the cortex during deep sleep? When you record during certain types of sleep, neurons look quite active. They fire lots of action potentials. There's lots of synaptic exchange going on, yet you're in a deep sleep. Why? Why not, if you believe that oscillation and synchrony is important, as many people believe, well, the state when you're really hypersynchronized is during a grand mal seizure, right? When all the neurons or a very large fraction is firing away. But then, of course, we're unconscious. Why? I mean, why isn't there consciousness there? As a clinician, you're confronted with some patients, like this one, where you only have usually intoxication, severe intoxication, drug or alcohol, where you only have very small islands of activity that are left. This is a metabolic PET scan, and you see only on this one hemisphere there's small islands left. Is this patient still conscious? Patient is completely unresponsive. Is this patient still conscious or not? I'd like to have a sort of a fundamental answer. What about fetuses? When is a fetus first conscious? There's some evidence to suggest that the massive surge in noradrenaline and epinephrine as the baby exits, through the birth canal, maybe that's the moment you have this massive stress that you're never going to experience any time again in your rest of your life. Is that when you become conscious? Are you already conscious in your mother's womb? What about a preterm infant? An infant born at 24 weeks. Is that conscious? We don't know. We don't have a good way. That's certainly alive. But for example, it's a very practical question. Do you do neonatal anesthesiology? If you have a preterm infant that's already in a very fragile state, and you need to do an operation, do you anesthetize this baby, further stressing the organism? Or do you not anesthetize because you think, well, it doesn't feel anything yet? What about certain types of anesthesia that leave the brain very active? For example, ketamine anesthesia. You get high activity in the brain. You get spindle and 40 hertz, etc. Is that really unconscious? What about other dissociative states, like, for example, sleepwalking? When people walk with open eyes and sometimes do quite complicated activities like riding a bike or driving or cutting, going to the bathroom or cutting things, etc. What about animals that are very different from us? So I made the argument that animals that are similar to us, that have similar limbs and ways of communicating, that have a cortex and a thalamus, etc., they also share some of the conscious experiences with us. But what about an animal that's very different, but very complex and capable of very sophisticated behaviors, like an octopus? Is an octopus conscious or not? And then, of course, there's the challenging question for the ages, for our age, that we're now increasingly surrounded by creatures that we create, that if a patient could do these things, we would have no trouble associating them with consciousness. So if a patient could play chess like Deep Blue, there would be no question that the patient would be conscious. If a patient could drive a car, like Google, self-driving car does, no question that the patient is conscious. If a patient can play a Jeopardy game, of course, or can do any of the other things, can talk, like Siri can now talk, there's no question that the patient would be conscious. Some of you may have seen the movie Her, right? And so in the movie Her, Samantha actually raises the question whether am I just programmed or am I truly experiencing something? And this is a question that in our generation, or your generation, will have to answer, as we're surrounded by creatures that rival us in intelligence. And so the question arises then, does it feel like something to be a Samantha? Does it feel like something to be Siri or a self-driving car? And how do I know? How can I test for this? So for this, we need a theory. Now, as philosophers, going back to Leibniz and more modern Chalmers and others have remarked, this may be a hard problem in a sense that's very difficult to approach. The hard problem is not explaining the various function of consciousness and is it in this part or that part. That's sort of epistemologically not a hard problem. That's a conceptual hard problem. It's a technologically hard problem. It's a scientifically hard problem, but not conceptually. But so we need a theory that starts with conscious experience, because once again, if I can return briefly to the beginning of my talk, the only way I know anything about life, the only way I know anything about the universe and about people and stars and dogs and trees is because of my sensation. Everything else I infer. It's a very reasonable inference. We do it all the time. We find that my inference is similar to your inference, etc. So we can do cross-validation, etc. But the only thing I have direct acquaintance with. The only thing I really only directly know is the fact that I have pains and pleasures and hear and see and smell. So we need to start with that. So we need a theory that starts with conscious experience, like here, and that ends up with the mechanisms, like a brain or maybe a computer. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about, in the second part, I'm going to talk about integrated information theory of consciousness. So this is the work of a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, Giulio Cenoni, who's many years, he has a big lab in medicine. He's one of the world's experts on sleep, and sleep disorders, and then also on consciousness. And this is done with many people in his lab, and he also collaborates widely, and I've collaborated with him since a number of years. So IIT, so let me first tell you some of the characteristics about IIT. So IIT starts from phenomenology. Most people, including what Francis Crick and I did early on, they start with the ideas. Let's look for the mechanisms in the brain that give rise to conscious sensation, because that'll help us to better understand consciousness. That is true. But ultimately, we need a theory, and I think you can only get a theory of consciousness by starting with the observable fact, the fact that I'm conscious. So we need to start with that. And then from that, we need to proceed to predictions that we can test in ourselves, in animals, in patients, and maybe also in machines. So the idea is that we identify the features of any one conscious experience. That's sort of an axiomatic approach, where we say, well, every conscious experience has these 5 properties associated with it. And then for each of these properties, we have a postulate that explains what's the mechanism that gives rise to this postulate, and associated theoretical calculus, the calculus of integrated information. So finally, you end up with IoT with a number called phi, and with a very high-dimensional mathematical construct called a concept in a high-dimensional space that's spanned by all the different potential states of my system in the future, one time step away, and all potential time steps from which the current state of my brain could have come. So it asks the following question. You have a system, a mechanism, like my brain, or like a brain in a dish, or like a couple of transistors, or like my iPhone, or like the internet, whatever. You have a physical system, a mechanism that's in one particular state. And with that state, I try to associate it. What is the conscious experience? What is the conscious experience, if any, of that particular state? So it depends on the state. And I know this because if my same brain has different states, I can either see red or blue, or feel funny, or feel depressed. Okay. So here, the way information is used is not in the extrinsic Shannon sense. It's really important to understand that. So here it's information. So of course, in the Shannon sense, it's always extrinsic, right? I have an external observer, I have an alphabet, and I send something, send in a receiver and send it through an informational challenge. So here, information is used in a sense the difference, or the differences that make a difference to the system itself, because conscious experience doesn't need an external observer. That's why it's sort of problematic to think about it, because it doesn't need. I don't depend on any of you. I don't depend on anything, right? My consciousness is intrinsic to me. In fact, that's the trouble with consciousness. I cannot directly inform you about my conscious state, except indirectly through my behavior. But you cannot directly access my conscious states. Okay, so it starts with these 5 axioms, and I will go through them, and then I'll introduce the calculus. Now, I'm under no illusion, it's a 2-hour presentation now, reduced to 1 hour. It's non-trivial. Just thinking about these things is very non-trivial, because it takes us in a way that typically we don't think about. And if you're really interested, there's a very large body now of mathematical and experimental work that you ought to refer to. So it makes a statement that any conscious experience has 5 characters. It exists. It's sort of trivial. It's really the Cartesian insight. It has composed of different elements. It is highly informative. It is integrated, and it's unique to one particular spatial temporal scale. So this, some of you may know, is a drawing that's colorized, a famous drawing by Ernst Mach, the physicist, that he did, I think, in 1880. So you can see him looking out of his left eye. You can see the bridge of his nose, looking out at, lying on a couch in a blue suit, and looking at his office. And so this is just, once again, experience is intrinsic to me, and it exists. doesn't depend on any of you. You guys could all disappear. I could be in a dream here, but there's no, I have an experience. And so that's what I want to explain. Any experience consists of different elements. For instance, space. There's to the left and to the right, and there's above, and there's below, and there's diagonal, etc. There are different elements in it. In this case, it's structured. But just an empty screen, you know, just a Ganzfeld, just if I look at an empty white screen, it's structured. It has left, right, up, down. Here, this thing has different elements in it. They're colored, etc. So it has many aspects. Any one conscious sensation I have is highly differentiated in a particular way. Right? So if you think about what you see right now, I mean, forget about hearing and, you know, that you feel the seat of your pants and all those other things. If you just think about visual consciousness, if you think about every frame of every movie you've ever seen or that you're ever going to see or that's ever been made, each one portrays a particular a particular scene, and you have a particular conscious experience. Even if you just see black, some of you may have woken up, if they arrived yesterday heavily jet lagged, they may have woken up, you know, at 2 in the morning here, if you came from Europe, totally discombobulated, right? The first thing you know is, you know, you're awake, you're conscious. You don't even know where you are and which hotel room, etc., and where the doors and all of that. But you have already a conscious experience, and that black is different from all the other things you've ever seen. Every conscious experience is unified, is integrated. So this is what people, going back to Aristotle, have remarked upon. It's a single, unitary, holistic thing. You cannot, for any one conscious element, it cannot be reduced to interdependent components. So for instance, I cannot, if I see you all, if I now have this conscious experience of all of you, I don't see the right hemisphere separate from the left hemisphere. The right visual field separate from the left. Of course, I can do this or I can do this, but you know, if I have this one conscious experience, I experience as a whole. If I, for example, if somebody says the word honeymoon, you know, I really have to, I can attend, of course, to the first word. That's one conscious experience. When I only hear honey, then you know, it's the stuff the bees make, or I can think about the astronomical object. But when I see honeymoon as a word or hear it, I think about, you know, the vacation people go on once they're married, right? And you have that's a single integrated experience. So that's the hallmark of consciousness. And lastly, for any one conscious entity, there's only one experience at any given point in time. It's unique. You're not a superposition of different experiences. It's not that there's one experience right now that sort of streams along at the frame rate, let's say, of 10 hertz or so, or 5 hertz, plus another conscious you that sort of goes at a time scale of hours, and another conscious you that operates at the time scale of microseconds, or another you that's conscious, for example, of your blood pressure, which we know you're not. There's only one, whatever it is, there's only one conscious experience. So in other words, across different spatial temporal granularity, there's only one. Okay, so now, so the claim is that this is like any axiomatic, that this is complete. Although, of course, that can't be proven, and it's well possible that in later time, people will have to add, you know, an axiom or two there. All right, but let's go with these postulates, with these axioms, and translate them into postulates. So let's think about a simple mechanism, and because of the math gets very hairy, it gets because of Bell's number, you have to look at the power set of all elements of a set, and then you have to look at all the partition among them. Scales very nastily. The math typically is done with these very simple networks that are binary and deterministic. Now, in principle, the math can also applies to continuous system, and certainly also applies to stochastic systems. But here, because it's just so much easier to do the math and to think about them, the idea is let's look at simple binary neurons, or more logical gates, that can be on or off. So here you have a simple switch. You have 3 different elements, you know, A, B, and C. They are an OR gate, an AND gate, and XOR gate. I mean, whatever mechanism you want, and they get some input from the outside, D, E, and F. And yellow is 1, and empty is, I mean, white is 0. And so you can write down the transition probability matrix, right? In this case, it's all deterministic, so each entry is either 0 or 1. And it's in a particular state, so it finds itself here you have this thing, this little gadget, you find it here, and it's in a particular state where gate A is on and B and C is off, so it's 1, 0, 0. And now you can ask, well, what are the states it could have come from in the past? That's its cause repertoire. So that's the way the theory says. It says, well, let's look at the states it could have come from, and let's look at the state the system is going to go to. Now, if the input is frozen in time, in other words, if they're clamped, if D is always off and E is always on, then it can only go to one particular state in the future in which A and B is off and C is on. But it could have originated, I don't have a laser pointer here, it could have originated from two different states. It could have arisen in the past from one of two states, 1, 1, 0 or 0, 0, 1, and they're colored in with 1, and it can go into one state. So it tells you something about that particular state and the reduction in uncertainty from how many states could it have come from. Because in principle, if there are three elements in your system, it could have come from 1 out of 8 states. But here, looking at this particular transition probability matrix, I know it can only have come from 2 in this particular state, and it can only go to 1 state. So the axiom once again is that consciousness exists intrinsically, and so the postulate is that to account for experience, a system, a set of mechanisms has to make a difference. To itself. It must have cause-effect power. Now, you probably have never thought about this. This is known in philosophy as Alexander's dictum, but it essentially says in order for anything to exist, it must make a difference to something else or to itself. Right? So if you're a physicist and you think about the notion of ether, that was popular around 1900. Today, no textbook mentions ether anymore, except as a historical curiosity. And it's not because ether has been disproven. It's just that ether has to have such a property that it may as well not exist. It's not empirical testable in any way. So people don't think about it anymore. It has no cause-effect power. It doesn't make any difference to anything in the physical world. Therefore, it may as well not exist. So this is a widespread principle, right? If there's something out there, if there's a little angel on Mars, but there's no way it can test it, it doesn't make difference to anything on Mars, then it may as well not exist. So here you apply that to a system intrinsically. You see, the system, for it to exist intrinsically, it has to make a difference to itself. This will have profound consequences. So you want the system to have a cause and an effect power. A cause power in the past. So here I plot the 8 different states, possible states in the 2 from which it could have gotten with probability of 1/2 if I'm unbiased, and the state it will go in the future. Composition. So here I said consciousness is structured. It's composed out of different sub-elements. Also, I take a mechanism like the 3 gates, and I look at all the possible elementary mechanisms. So I look at the power set of all mechanisms. There's, of course, only A, when the state of B and C is indeterminate. So I assume it's given as outside noise. They're random, independently distributed, or B or C. Or I look at the state, the system AB in this particular state, where A is 1 and B is 0. Remember, I always do this for the system of one particular state, in which A is 1 and B and C are both 0. I can do this for every possible state, but here I'm looking at it for one state. Or I can look at the entire mechanism. The higher order mechanism consists of all 3 elements. And for each one, I can write down such a cause-effect repertoire. So here I wrote down the one that's in when C is 0 and the other 2 gates are independently distributed, independent. Then I ask, consciousness is specific. So each experience is composed in the particular way it is because it differs from all the other experiences. And so the way the system does this for this very simple example. So remember, the system only has 8 states, right? So it's quite simple. I look at all the different, I look at the power set of all mechanisms. In each one, I define the cause effect. If it's in state, if I'm just considering the mechanism A, which is in state 1 and the other 2 are indeterminate, or I look at the AB mechanism where A is 1 and B is 0 and C is indeterminate, etc. And I look at the cause and an effect repertoire. And then the theory introduces a distance. It wants to measure sort of how irreducible these different states are. It wants to measure how integrated these different states are. The idea is that a system that makes no difference to itself doesn't exist. Once again, so if I have a system that consists of two independent subsystems, let's say I take two brains and put them together, but they don't interact. The two systems as a system do not exist. You can think about it in terms of joint entropy. The joint entropy of two independent systems is just the sum of the individual entropy. So they don't exist at that higher level system. They only exist as two independent systems. So essentially the theory, let me see, the theory looks at the system and looks at all possible partitions. And for each possible partition it asks how big is how irreducible is the system? It defines a metric of irreducibility. And then it asks how irreducible is the system? And out of all possible partitions, it picks the one that's the least irreducible. Because that is, the idea is you try to quantify the non-partitionability, the non-irreducibility of a system. So that fundamentally comes down to it. You have a mechanism, it's in a particular state, and you ask how irreducible is this? And you can define a number associated with that. That's phi. It's defined as it's the Earth mover distance between the probability distribution in the path and the current, and the probability distribution between the current state and the future. And you pick the minimum. It's a positive number. And then an exclusion says of all the different systems that I could pick. Because there are all these different systems. There's a system ABC, there's a system AB and BC and AC and A and B and C. I pick the one that's maximally irreducible because there's only one conscious experience. There's only one cause, and that's the maximal cause. And there's only one effect that's the maximal effect for any one state. So finally, what the system says, there's a mechanism in front of me. It's in a particular state. I can define how irreducible this set of mechanism is. If it's reducible, completely reducible, then its phi will be 0. So phi is a positive number, 0 or positive. If it's 0, it means completely irreducible. It's completely irreducible. It means it doesn't exist at that particular scale. Maybe subcomponents exist. And you can also define you can define a concept space where the particular configuration that's associated with this particular mechanism exists. So this is a high-dimensional space. It's a space that has as many. So here you can see this has possible 8 states in the past and 8 states in the future. So the total space in which this exists is 16-dimensional. And here, so here you have a system. So in principle, I need to plot this in a 16-dimensional space. As I can't do that, here it's plotted separately for the past states in a 2-dimensional subspace of the 8-dimension, and for the 8 states in the future against the 2-dimensional subspace. So each of these axes, there should be in 16 axes, is a probability from 0 to 1 that the system will find itself in that particular state or comes from that particular state. And you do for each of the mechanisms, so A and B and C and AB and BC and ABC, each of that has a particular vector associated in that space that's outlined by the yellow stars, and the size of that yellow star is essentially the phi. How irreducible is it? How different from 0 is it? And the central claim of the theory is, it's a very stark one. It's a very striking one, that any one conscious experience is identical to this conceptual structure that's maximally irreducible. That's what conscious experience is. It's sort of conscious experience, it's turned into geometry. Like Pythagoras always said, it's not algebra, it's geometry that's at the heart of everything. So the irreducibility, the non-partitionability of that particular mechanism, that's its quantity, phi. And the quality, the way it feels like something, is given by this particular configuration. And for each different state, even the same mechanism, you get, if the mechanism is in a different state, you'll get a different shape, and you feel something. The conscious experience is different, as we know it has to be in our case. And the system only exists if it is irreducible. All right. I assume this all makes perfect sense to you. but let me take you through some of the implications that can be tested. Right, so once again, it's sort of radical, this theory. It says, okay, there's a conscious experience. You know, you see something. You see your body lying down. So you look at the mechanism, the brain. Here it's a highly simplified brain, right, that gets input just like it gets from the room. So E and D is your visual input, and you're in a particular state in which you experience something. This state is associated with this high-dimensional quality space that's proportional to all the states your brain could have come from in the immediate past, which of course is a trillion-dimensional number, and all the states it could go to at the next time step at the relevant time scale, which is probably, you know, it's an experimental test. Well, we think it's 10, 20, 50, 100 milliseconds. And so in this incredible high-dimensional space, the geometry of that's what you experience as subjective experience. That's what it is. That's what it is to be conscious. As simple as that. And so any system that has a phi that's different from 0 will have conscious experience. Very little. So the simplest system that can have experience, that can feel the difference between this and not this, would be a diode and a 1-bit flip-flop. Diode in a 1-bit flip-flop, you can show according to this theory, has a phi that's minimal, but it is conscious of this and not this. Of course, it doesn't even know about dark, because dark presupposes a whole lot of notion of other things. So it has a number of interesting implications. One of the implications is, for example, you can take a system like here. So here you have a set of 3 times 5 neurons, I mean, quote, neurons. And they're wired together in this particular way. And you can compute the phi, 10.56, okay? So according to the theory, it's somewhat conscious. It has some experience. Now you perturb the wires systematically. You add noise to it. And now you can see, well, the phi will be reduced. And there's interesting a point, if you add more and more noise on the right, where suddenly the system, the overall system has a phi of 0.03, right? So first it's very big, but then you add more and more noise, and suddenly the cluster of 3 neurons, they become more integrated because of all the noise you inject, and suddenly rather you have one conscious. On the left, you have a system at 1 conscious. On the right, suddenly it breaks down into 5 separate consciousness because the local phi is bigger. This case is 0.19 compared to the phi of the entire system. So the Gedanken experiment here that we can do in 5 or 10 years, certainly for animal brains, and possible also in human brain, you take my brain. So right now, of course, my left brain talks to the right brain through the corpus callosum, the 200 million fibers I mentioned before. If I now progressively add noise to the corpus callosum and make it more and more noisy, the theory predicts at some point nothing will happen, nothing. At some point, when the integration across here is going to be reduced below the integration that's just present in the left or just present in the right, that at that point abruptly my conscious Christoph experience will disappear and 2 smaller consciousness will be created. One in the left that can talk because it's access to Broca's area, and one in the right. And you can play this game reversibly. You can now reduce the noise again, then again consciousness will expand. Why? Because of the exclusion axiom. Because the axiom says for any one system there can only be one conscious experience. Okay. Okay, let's skip that. Here, it's a very interesting consequence, particular for this conference. If you have a purely feed-forward system, like you would have, for example, in deep convolutional network, the system cannot make any difference to itself because it's purely feed-forward, so it doesn't have a cause-effect repertoire on itself. And for that, you need to have feedback. So the theory says very clearly, it may be wrong, but it's certainly a very clear prediction that a purely feed-forward system has no phi. It's completely reducible. It doesn't exist because it doesn't make a difference to itself intrinsically. It makes a difference to other things, but it doesn't make a difference to itself. And consciousness is all about making a difference to itself. And I'll come back to that. So you can also, it offers a very precise definition of what the NCC is. So the NCC is this empirical defined term. In terms of the theory, there's a very precise definition what it is. It's essentially, it's a complex associated with the maximum irreducible cause-effect structure. It can change, of course, dynamically, as we know it can. Depending on my current state and what I'm currently conscious of, it can wax and wane across the brain. And it exists at the spatial scale it does, because once again, there's this axiom of exclusivity. So really, you have to ask, at what scale is there the maximal interaction among the network? Is it at the scale of 2 neurons, 10 neurons, 1 million neurons, 1 billion neurons? Is it at the scale of 10 milliseconds or 20 milliseconds? Is it at the scale of individual vesicular release, which occurs at the time scale of a second? Is it at the scale of bursting, which is a time scale of 10 milliseconds? Is it at the scale of sort of, a column maybe that's more 100? Is it at the scale of FMI that's more a second? Those are a purely empirical question, but the theory says of all the scales, for any one point in time, it's the one that's max, that gives rise to the maximal irreducible system, for that system at that point in time. All right, let's skip that. All right, so there are some really interesting predictions. One of them has already been verified. So they published, this is Mazzini and Tononi's team, they published 2 papers in Science, 2 separate papers, where they use what they call zip and zap. So you take a subject, these are normal, healthy subject. In this case, you need to sleep deprive them for a day. And then you wire them up with an EEG with 128 channels just to look at their brain waves. And then, can you see that coil there? Figure 8 coil. So that's a so-called TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation coil. It sends a brief magnetic pulse that it will induce in the underlying brain some electrical activity. So you zap the brain. So essentially, think of it, you have the way I think about it, you have a church bell, right, a bell, and you want to hear the quality of its sound. And so what you do, you knock against it with a hammer or something. And then if it's a true bell, you hear it reverberate. You can hear the tones and the overtones for a long time. So that's essentially what you're doing here. So you zip it with a TMS, and then you look at the reverberation in EEG, which you can reconstruct using Loretta or some other source localization software. So here, for example, if you do that 100 times or so to average across the variability, what you see, first you get the pulse, and then you see these waves that go across the brain. They go here, they go contralateral, they ricochet across the other side, cross the corpus callosum, go back and forth, etc. Okay, and now you can essentially use a Lempel zip, that's why they call it zip. You can use an algorithm to essentially measure, you find some pragmatic way to measure the complexity of this. Because you want to compare it, for example, to a state when you do the same experiment, but when you're not conscious because you're in a deep, dreamless sleep in non-REM. So now actually you get a bigger response in non-REM to the same strength pulse as before. It's bigger, locally it's bigger, but then it subsides much more quickly and is much less complicated. And again, you can show that you do the source localization, you plot it onto two-dimensional, you unfold it, plot it on a two-dimensional surface, use Lempel zip to reduce it, and you get a number. They call it the PCI, Perturbational Complex Index. And here it's going to be low, and for the previous state it's going to be high. All right? Now this is the obvious state, conscious and non-conscious. Essentially they want to have a measure for how integrated. This is a simple, very approximative measure. Right? It's a very crude measure that tells you, is that person in front of me conscious but just claiming to be, well, he's just not moving but he's actually fully conscious, or maybe it's a patient who can move but is fully conscious, or is a brain not conscious, by measuring how integrated is the cerebral cortex. That's essentially what this does. Okay, so they did this first in normals, and you find that the brain is less integrated in sleep. It's more dissociated in sleep than it is by this measure. And now they've done this in many more other clinically interesting cases. They've done it with anesthesiologists in 3 different cases of different types of anesthesia. Okay, and they've done it, so that's here. So you can plot on the left, the colorful one, those are just individual subjects. When they're awake, you get a high PCI for each individual. On the right, you take volunteers. These were anesthesiologists, either when they sleep or when they go through different sorts of propofol, xenon, and diazepam type of anesthesia. And when they are fully anesthetized by conventional clinical measure, the phi is low. You can see it has that low distribution. The PCI, sorry, the perturbational complexity index is low. And when they are awake and conscious, it's high. And then much more interesting is if you can do it in patients. Because I said there are roughly in the US alone on the order of 10,000 patients who are in this state where they are
most of them are PVS, persistent vegetative state. A small number of them are probably in an MCS state, that they are minimal conscious state, that on occasion, sometimes during the day, sometimes when they have fever, it's very idiosyncratic, they sort of can purposefully interact with their environment, at least for a brief amount of time. Most of the time they're not. And you really want to know, is that patient that I'm caring for since half a year, does she feel something? Is there anguish? Is there pain associated with her state? Or is it truly a zombie with only a brainstem is left, but all consciousness has been gone, as all the evidence suggests happened in Terry Schiavo. And here, very nicely, we've done this now in 90 different patients, in vegetative state patient, in minimal conscious patient, in emerging minimal conscious state, and in locked-in state. Locked-in state, of course, they're fully conscious, they just cannot move, like the novelist in the movie The Butterfly, or the book, the Diving Bell and the Butterfly. And in each case, at the level of individual, you can ascertain that this measure is low when all the evidence suggests that the patient is not conscious, and is high when the evidence suggests the patient has some measure of consciousness. So for the first time, it appears to be that we have a clinical relevant conscious meter that tells us to what extent is cortex integrated or not. We have to see, it's always tested in various clinical centers to see whether it truly holds up. That's pretty cool. So it has a number of so, for example, how does IT deal with the fact that the cerebellum doesn't contribute at all, or seemingly not at all? Well, if you look at the architecture of the cerebellum, so you may know it has these beautiful neurons called Purkinje cell. They're among the biggest neurons that there are in the brain. And, but they're sort of two-dimensional, very elaborate dendritic tree and calcium activity and whatnot, but they're really two-dimensional. And the entire brain, the cerebellum is organized in two-dimensional slabs, interconnected by these literally billions of parallel fibers. And so the geometry is really two-dimensional geometry. While cortex is three-dimensional, it has more of a small world network connectivity. So the explanation according to IT is the complexity of the circuit is drastically reduced in cerebellum compared to cortex. Yes, it's a brain and it has action potential, all of that, but it has very low phi due to the nature of its circuitry. Again, the same explanation would hold for cortex during deep sleep. There you have integration, but you have very little differentiation because all the neurons are highly synchronized. During seizures, you have the opposite. You have complete synchrony. Everybody fires, but of course there's no differentiation going on since it's a very simple state. You can also extrapolate. As I said, you have a consciousmeter that can tell now whether this brain of this patient is conscious. And in principle, you can apply to all these cases. In particular, you can apply it, for us most interesting, to non-mammalian animals to test to what extent, a bird, that's very complex, that can hide, has food caches, 5,000 different food caches, to what extent a squid that can do imitation learning, has highly social creature is conscious, or to the extent to which a bee that only has 800,000 neurons, but whose circuit complexity is 10 times higher per unit volume than the complexity of the human brain, to what extent a bee is conscious. At this point, we simply don't know. Now let me come back to Apple Siri. Okay, but first a number of predictions that you can test. The theory makes a number of profoundly counterintuitive predictions. Now, of course, just falling Bayesian probability here, the more surprising a prediction of any theory is, assuming the prediction turns out to be true, the more you're willing to believe it. Thus, for example, Einstein's general relativity, it made this very surprising prediction that mass can be big enough that it rips a hole in space-time and nothing can escape, including light. And at the time, people didn't take it seriously. Then it was derided as black hole. And now, of course, black hole is an accepted astronomical object. And at the center of most galaxies, including our own, is a black hole. Seems to be a black hole. So there's one particular very surprising prediction that you can test certainly in animals now, and you can, maybe in a couple of years, you can test it in people. So you do the following experiment. You You look at a gray, so here you have a human brain that looks at a gray apple in a gray room, okay? And you see a gray apple, and the person says gray apple, okay? Now you inactivate, okay, and so up there's a color area, you know, schematized. Let's call it V8, and it's a color area. So this is the area that if you lose, you get what's called achromatopsia. So no neurons are firing on the upper example because you're not looking at anything colored. It's a gray room, just like this. No other colors, no neurons are firing. You see gray, uncontroversial. Now I do a second experiment with channel rhodopsin where I inactivate. Of course, this I can right now only do in a mouse, where I inactivate the same area V8. Okay, so I turn all the neurons off for 100 milliseconds using green light. Now, in both cases, neurons don't fire. In the first case, they don't fire because there's nothing that makes, they could fire, but they don't because there's nothing in the environment that makes them fire. In the second case, they can fire because I've imposed this technique. I've prevented them from firing. So most people would think about it, well, clearly in both cases, the message conveyed to the rest of the brain is the same. Neurons don't fire. So in both cases, the experience would be the same. But the theory says no. In the first case, you have a normal cause-effect repertoire. You just happen to be in a system that particular subpart, V8, doesn't fire, but it could fire. In the other case, you've drastically eliminated, you've just totally reduced the effect repertoire and the cause-effect repertoire of that system by essentially imposing from the outside, using this fancy optogenetics technology, a particular state. So it couldn't have come from any other state, and it cannot go to any other state because you've imposed control on it. So in one case, you'll see gray. In the other case, you'll probably get a complete achromatopsia where you don't know what color is anymore. And there are patients like that. There's some patients who know what green is, but they don't see green anymore. And there are other patients who just don't know what color is anymore because they completely lost, it's called deep or complete achromatopsia. They completely lost even the concept of color. And so here, the theory says those are different states. Once again, the theory says the consciousness is not in the sending of a message from one part of the brain to the other. It's not about messaging. It's about the difference that makes a difference to the system itself. And here the system, the bottom one, cannot make a difference to itself locally because you've clamped it. It's a little bit, there's this short story of Sherlock Holmes, of Conan Doyle, a Sherlock Holmes story called Silver Blaze, which you might know, where the key clue that Sherlock Holmes gives to the police is the fact that the dog didn't bark. And like in any good Sherlock Holmes story, of course, the police inspector's clueless and doesn't get it, says, well, why is that important? Well, the dog didn't bark. And of course, it turns out to be crucial because the fact that the dog didn't bark but could have tells Sherlock Holmes that the dog knew the intruder, right? If the dog would have been poisoned, then it wouldn't have given Sherlock Holmes that information. But given the fact that the dog could have barked but didn't, that was very informative. So likewise here. So this is something that you can test in animals and possible also in people. Another related, profoundly counterintuitive explanation of the theory is that, which is why I really like it, is that you can do the following. You can record all my brain cells, let's say, for the last hour. Okay, we all went through this common experience over the last hour where I talked and you were silent. And then you take that, so you record from all my brain cells, and now you impose that using the same optogenetics technology, you impose that back on my brain. So essentially, my brain is now being forced to replay. Every neuron has to fire the same action potential because you impose it on it with optogenetics. Right, so in principle, you say, well, in both cases, the trajectory of my neuron in space-time is the same. Right, because neuron here fires at a particular point in time and here doesn't fire at a different point in time. Yet in one case it could have done, it had its full cause-effect repertoire. In the other case it didn't have any choice in the matter, as it were, because it was imposed from the outside. And so therefore the theory says in one case I will not be conscious at all. In the other case I'm conscious of whatever I'm conscious of. Okay, let's skip that. It makes several other counterintuitive prediction. So the theory says that for any one system, within the purview of the system, the only thing exists is the one that's maximally, the only system that exists is the one associated with the maximal irreducible system. That's the one that gives rise to conscious, or that the one is conscious experience. So you can have the following paradoxical situation in this brain here. Of course, you can have a separate, you have parts of my brain like isn't connected at all, like on the bottom, it can be off having its own conscious experience. But even within an interconnected brain, like the one on top with the 5 neurons indicated in red, you can have 2 complexes. One, which is the biggest one, but if there's another one and the 2 complexes do not overlap, then you would have a system that has 2 separate conscious experiences. One would be, depending on the exact number and distribution and connectivity, one would be the major one and the other one would be a minor one. And if the major one, the one on top, happens to have access to Broca's area, that's the one, of course, that can talk. But nonetheless, there's this other one. And so you can have this is a hypothesis because it is puzzling. Over the last 50 years, in particular over the last 30 years now, given the research and the interest in consciousness, psychologists have amused themselves by showing all sorts of things that you can do, at least under trained conditions, unconscious. All sorts of things that you can do visually, for instance, that you don't perceive. And so one explanation is, well, it's really done by, there's this major, the major conscious complex, the one that talks. But there's another one that maybe sometimes pushes the buttons that allows you to, when you have the signal, and that carries out the behavior. But since it's not the consciousness one, it's not the one if I query you, what did you see, or what did you feel? You didn't see it because it's a top one, but not in the middle one. Again, that can be tested. It's counterintuitive, but can be tested. Let me come to 2 last points here. So one is, what is the function of consciousness? Why would creature with high phi evolve? So to do that, we've done over the last years, we've done a number of simulations where we do like simple Breitenberg vehicles. We endow them with genomes, so simple animals. We endow them with genomes. We send them through an environment. We select the fittest 10% of the population. The other 90% die. We mutate the genome. We do point mutation, deletion, insertions, and we send the next generation through. And we do this thousands of times. And then we plot phi, for instance, as these creatures become more adapted to the environment. So here we can only do this for small creatures, just because the complexity of the underlying measure, the underlying metric. So here we have a simple creature vehicle, has 2 motors, left and right, 10 and 11. And then it has 3 retina pixels, it has door sensors, and then it has a bunch of internal bits. Now they're wired up there. These are little Markov processes, and their connectivity is specified by the genome. And early on, it's completely random. The sensors aren't even wired in. It's completely random. Okay, so you have 6 input bits, 4 internal bits, and 2 output bits. And then you send them through this. You do an artificial life simulation where you have a genome. As I said, you send them in. In this case, it's a maze. I'll show you a movie. They go through this maze, and you always at the end of so each life lasts 1,000 time step. And at the end of the 1,000 time step, you evaluate all your critters, and you pick the 10% most, the fittest one. In this case, the ones that have gone the farthest into the maze. The other ones you throw away, and then you mutate the genome and you send them in again, and you do this 60,000 times. Some of you will know this sound. You know and love it. Remember that? All right. So this guy here doesn't know anything. This is the animate at generation number 12. So that's the state of the various Markov random networks inside there. It just gets stuck there. It's very early on in this life. And remember, they were born, the first generation of the species had random wiring. Okay, so now we send them, we're 300 organisms, we send them through this maze, and we do it again and again and again. And then we, no noise. Right, and now it's learned, just by has to learn a one-bit memory, essentially. Then it does so much better. But it has to learn it. And in this case, the learning is by evolution, by going on this very, very high-dimensional fitness landscape. All right, so here you can see, so this is, after we sort of evolved this for, I can't remember, 128 times, so we have an evolution 60,000 generation, and we do this 128 times. In each case, we go from the fittest organism at the end, and we trace back the line of descent. And so here you can see, for example, some of these guys discover this one-bit memory at around generation 15,000. Of course, some never discover this memory, and they're forever stuck on that plane there. So now we can simply plot. Here's a simple measure of how adapted they are, because it's an absolute metric. And you can see, in this case, there's a very nice measure relationship between how fit they are, in other words, how fast do they go after selection through the maze, and their minimal complexity in terms of phi, the phi of the main complex of the maximal irreducible one. And the intuition is simply that if you are evolved in a complex environment, if you integrate your information, let's say you have different sensors, like a retina sensor and a proximity sensor, clearly, rather than keeping them separate, if you integrate all that information and consider the joint probability distribution of both the door sensor as well as the retina sensor, that's much more efficient than if you just if you don't consider them, right? It's a simple idea. And so therefore, the claim is that consciousness arises because of the adaptability of the underlying network. That if you're integrated, if you're maximally irreducible, in some sense you will also have achieved for any particular environment that you involve, the best possible adapting strategy for that particular environment. Now, the system solves a number of problems. So one problem that in philosophy is known as the aggregate problem, which is, why isn't there a room consciousness? Right? So there are roughly, I don't know, 150 people in this room. Each of one is conscious. Why isn't there a consciousness that consists out of 150 people? Or in fact, John Searle reviewed my book in the New York Review of Books recently. He said, well, why isn't there a consciousness of America? There's 310 million Americans. They're all conscious. Why isn't there no Uber consciousness? Well, once again, the theory says very clearly there isn't, because you pick the local maximum. And the idea is that even if I talk with one of you, if we actually have a two-way exchange of information, not just me talking, then the amount of information exchanged between the two of us pales in comparison to the amount of integrated information within my brain. So once again, I can do a Gedanken experiment that will be possible probably over the next 20 to 30 years. If I can directly connect some of my neurons with some of your neurons directly using some futuristic, laser, fiber, beam, whatever technology, and now systematically increase the bandwidth of this connection. So now our two brains are connected. If the bandwidth is very little early on, then I may have access to some of the states in your brain, but I'm still me. It's just that I'm me with some additional information. Or I can now see your blood pressure, or wherever my neurons are connected to your neurons. But at some point, the theory predicts if the non-reducibility between our two brains exceeds that of within the brain, just because the bandwidth here is very high, then at that point, abruptly, I will disappear and you will disappear, and instead there will be this new Uber consciousness that consists out of this agglomeration of our two brains. And it's totally reversible. If you reduce the bandwidth again below that limit, then again there'll be two individual consciousness in the two individual brains. It also has this falling, and I wanted to end on this, it has this very surprising consequence. So remember I said any feed-forward system, at least by the measure of the theory, it's a very clear prediction. The theory says that any purely feed-forward system, like a deep convolutional network, because it doesn't have a cause-effect repertoire on itself, it doesn't affect itself, it can affect others, but because it's not coupled to itself, will have zero phi. Well, so of course what you can do for any one system like this one here on the left that's heavily feedback, I can build equivalent, there's an equivalent expression of the system that's purely feed-forward for a limited amount of time steps, right? So this is only true for a limited amount of time step. I can make the two systems equivalent in terms of their I/O. Although the one on the right is always much, much more complicated. Clearly it has vastly more components and vastly more wires, but in terms of input-output transitions, for the same input, it gives you the same output, both on the left and on the right, for a limited amount of time step. So the theory says, well, one system would have conscious experience, but the other one doesn't, although both do the same thing. And then lastly, so that's the human brain. On the right, upper right and lower left, is an attempt by Henry Markham, a colleague and friend of mine, at the Human Brain Project in Switzerland to build a biophysically accurate human brain simulation. So let's say Henry Markham in the fullness of time is successful, and now we have a computer simulation that simulates at the micro level, so at the level of neurons and whatever level we think is relevant, that simulates the human brain. Most philosophers would say, they're functionalists, would say, well, if it simulates a human brain, then everything that comes with the human brain, including consciousness, comes with it. The theory says no. The theory says quite clearly no. This brain simulation is not conscious. Why? Because it doesn't have the cause-effect repertoire. You have to look at the actual cause-effect repertoire. And the actual cause-effect repertoire of the computer is a cause-effect repertoire of its actual mechanism, which is the cause-effect repertoire of the actual transistors on the ALU and on the CPU. And of course that's very different from the human brain, because if you look at the typical connectivity of an ALU, it's like 3 to 4 transistors talking to each other rather than 10,000 of neurons directly talking to each other. So fundamentally, for the same reason that you can simulate the weather very well, exceedingly well, at least short term, but it will never be wet inside that weather simulation computer, right? Or you can simulate the evolution, as astrophysicists do. You can simulate the evolution of galaxy, including the black hole at the center of our galaxy. But of course, space-time around that computer will never be distorted or bent just because it's simulated. So that's the difference. That's a profound difference, if you think about it, between the simulated and the real. If you wanted to build a computer, if you wanted to build a model of the brain that's conscious, you actually have to build it the hard way. You have to build it using a neuromorphic computer, like for example IBM is trying to do with True North. So there's nothing magical about the human brain. It's not that you need some special stuff, some soul stuff, but it's just in order to replicate consciousness, human level consciousness, you have to replicate the human brain level cause-effect repertoire, and you can't do that with a simple digital simulation. You actually have to emulate it using a neuromorphic computer. All right, so I wanted to end. Once again, people are going to say, I mean, the myriad of questions, what about emotions and what about memory and all these other things? They're all great questions, but once again, the theory says that conscious experience really comes down to experience. It tries to explain the nature of any one experience, including self, experience of self, or awareness of self, or awareness of red, or awareness of other things. Those are, what they all share, they feel like something. They have an experience as subjective consciousness. IT starts from conscious experience, and then rather than trying to bring consciousness out of the brain, it starts with conscious experience and then explains what is the character of any mechanism that it has to obey in order to have a conscious experience. And fundamentally it says any piece of very organized matter will have conscious experience with it. And in this formulation, information is intrinsic. It's the difference that the system makes to itself. So it's, once again, it's not a Shannon type of information. Consciousness is not a message that's being broadcast. So the theory ultimately postulates that we live in a universe where we have conscious experiences because our underlying mechanism is highly organized, and that's the way it is. And with that, I'm open for questions. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, so I guess there's a microphone there.
Hello, I very much enjoyed your talk and find it very interesting. So I just have one quick technical question. Do we know anything about the relationship between the phi measure you proposed and the connectivity of the network? So I was imagining, for example, if I have a big network which is, say, fully connected with randomly chosen functions at each node, does that have a high phi or a low phi?
No, if you use random connections, it's not, you want to use small world connectivity. What you want highly heterogeneous architectures where you have nodes that do very different things, and you want to use sort of, in general, a small world connectivity. If you use random or very regular ones, typically phi is not that high.
Okay, that's cool. And the other question is about the gray apple example and the hypothesis you're posing. So I was wondering, I can't understand the logic of your prediction, because if we believe that the state of all the neurons in our brain is a sufficient statistics of the history of how it has been for the past, then if exactly the same state has been imposed, how can that, well, you can say that like if the states are imposed, it doesn't have consciousness, while if it's automatically happen, it has consciousness. But how can we make a difference in the phenomena that happens after that, given that at the point where the experiment ends, they're in exactly the same state?
Well, okay, so physicalism is not violated because, of course, physically, I have to do things to the system in order to prevent it from firing, right? So channel adopts in particular, I have to insert membranes and and channels there, and they have to open. You have to get, the chloride conductance and all the other one. So so physically, it's not the same system. So it's not true that it's exactly the same system. It's what is similar between the two systems, in both cases, neurons fire or don't fire. In both cases, the same neurons fire and don't fire. But in one case, because they could not fire, because they couldn't fire in any other way than they were, you sort of force them down there, they have no cause-effect power. They don't have any cause. They don't have any cause in the past, except externally imposed cause, and they don't have, they cannot influence their future. So they make no difference to the system itself. And that's what the theory says fundamentally is what conscious is about. And so you can test this, not in that version, but you can test a simpler version of this with this gray apple actually in people and certainly in animals to find out is it true.
Hi. My question has to do with time, because there's something about time in what you're saying with the states coming from the past and going to the future in particular ways, but at the same time you seem to be describing a conscious experience as a state, as a sort of snapshot. And I wonder, I don't know, is that true, or is there something dynamical, sort of inherently in our experience that you can't take a snapshot?
Okay, it's a wonderful question. I wrote an entire paper about it. There's a considerable amount of evidence that there is, in fact, this snapshot hypothesis that any one conscious experience is a snapshot with time and the perception of time painted onto it. We know experimentally we can manipulate the perception of flow of time, right? If you jump out of a plane, for instance, your time of, if somebody holds a gun to your head, your time perception will greatly vary than if you are, preparing, reading a boring math text. So, and the idea is that that's associated with a particular state, including the state of motion, that the state of motion itself is a particular conscious state. And then, of course, it changes with some dynamics. But that each state itself has a dynamic element. So that's currently a hypothesis that's being pursued by a number of labs. It's a test. It's a prediction, not of this particular theory. This theory doesn't necessarily impose that it has to be a constant chunk in time.
Hi, I've got two questions. First of all, so why is the feed-forward neural network not conscious, but the diode is?
It's a diode connected with a 1-bit memory flip-flop. Sorry.
Okay.
So it's very counterintuitive, because a diode with about 1-bit memory, that can't be a lot of consciousness. But we live in a universe where minus 270 degrees is still warm, because there's still 1 degree of, you can still extract some work from a piece of matter that's 270 degrees, although for us it's unimaginable cold. So.
Okay. And the second question is, speaking of counterintuitive, so in your experiment with the color region, like the gray apple, so the difference supposedly is that in one case the neurons could have fired but didn't, in the other case the neurons couldn't fire because you suppressed
Correct.
them. So are you saying that the people would report a different experience in that case?
Correct.
But how can that be? Because for them to report something different, the area that speaks has to be in different states. But in both cases, it didn't get input. So how can physically it be that there's an effect on the rest of the brain if in both cases the neurons don't fire?
Well, because once again, it's not about signaling. It's about the nature of the conscious experience, right? And the nature of the conscious experience in that brain that would presumably include a connection, including to the Broca's. Well, it may or may not include a connection to Broca's area. The maximal irreducible structure will be different in those two cases. So there will be difference in the rest of the brain. I'm not saying the entire brain is the same. I'm just saying in the area that we think is critical for color vision, there the state of the neurons will be the same. In one case by choice, as it were, in the other case by necessity. But outside there will be differences.
Okay, thanks.
For the reason you mentioned.
So I was wondering if you could say more about the consciousness of, you mentioned the consciousness of America as something that you wanted to exclude, but it wasn't obvious to me why a collection of conscious individuals doesn't have a lot of properties similar to a brain. I mean, you have complicated actors communicating, and there's some notion of self-monitoring in a society, so it doesn't seem obvious to me that that's not a conscious entity. So I was wondering if you could say more about that and why it's something that you don't want to perceive as conscious.
Yeah, so the theory says very clearly it's a fifth axiom, exclusive. So you pick the one that's maximum. And even though if we can have a conversation, where we exchange maybe 10 or 20 bits or so per minute or 30 bits, when people try to estimate actually how much information we can exchange when we're engaged in a true conversation, the amount that pales against the amount of information that's integrated in my brain. So there's my brain that's conscious, there's your brain, it's conscious, but the sort of, if I compute the maximal, if I apply IIT to us here, it's a very, very small number. And since it involves there's a much bigger number I can get from this brain by just concentrating locally. It says this is the biggest. Well, this, including in your brain, is much, much, much smaller. Because of sort of the greatly reduced interaction between when we talk. As I said, we could in principle do things differently if we had some new technology that would enhance the way our brains directly interact.
So why doesn't similar reasoning apply to you have local cortical circuits that are very tightly connected. I mean, could you then decompose the brain into locally connected components that you consider more conscious than the whole?
Yes. So there's an entire book written in the 19th century, way before the split brain, that argues there are actually two conscious minds, and you can sometimes feel echoes of that in your own life. Like when there's this one mind that communicates to you primarily using images, and the other one is primarily an auditory voice-based one. But so that's what I said with a major and a minor. It suggests that under some condition there may be two or maybe even more consciousness under pathological conditions possibly, and depends on the exact neural footprint of them. The one that has access to Broca's area is the one that typically talks. So the suspicion would be there's always a big one, the dominant one, and then there may be one or more smaller ones.
How about a single neuron? I mean, it's interconnected with itself, right? You have the molecules.
Yeah, so if you have an isolated single neurons, it may, just like, there's heat out there in space, it's only 4 degrees above 4 degrees Kelvin. If I have an isolated neuron, yeah, it may well have some minimal amount of, right now, that's what the theory says. I don't know how to test that right now experimentally. Yeah, but it says consciousness. It shares some of this is ancient belief in the West, as well as, of course, in Buddhism, called panpsychism. So panpsychism argues that consciousness is in many things, not just in humans, and consciousness can also be graded. So IIT shares some of those beliefs. Of course, it also solves the problem of aggregate, because it says there's no consciousness in superposition. Superposition, you're conscious, I'm conscious, but there's no superordinate consciousness. Yeah, but if I have a dish, so at the Institute we're building these neural networks where you have, a million neurons, human, that have
from stem cells. For all I know, if they're complex enough, it may feel a little bit like to be something, to be a million neurons in a dish. I don't know how to test that right now, though.
Okay, comment and a question. Comment being that a feed-forward convnet, while it's being trained, actually does feed back on itself. So maybe the lesson here is so long as you're learning, you're conscious, but after you stop learning, maybe you're not. And then the...
Oh, wait, that's beautiful, because there's a lot of...
Yeah, I thought so too, thank you.
No, it's beautiful because there's a lot of experimental evidence, particularly when I mentioned psychologists amuse themselves now by showing that all sorts of things you can do unconsciously, but typically only you first need to learn them. And so the claim is that to learn them you need consciousness, but then later on, once you learn them, you can do them without seeing them. Right. So that may be for the reason you mentioned.
Okay, and so as far as the gray apple, it seems to me you've actually changed the system when you introduce the ablation or the channel rhodopsin or whatever. Because in the first place, there is no option for it not to fire. You've actually changed the cause and effect repertoire, so you're not comparing the same system anymore. So I would suspect that the hypothesis doesn't actually make sense. I mean, in the case of Sherlock Holmes, the system never changed. It was always the case that he could get the information on whether or not the dog was poisoned. Whereas it's possible, I guess we just don't know, it's possible that other neurons are always probing, say, this region of the brain to find out if it's able to fire, and if so, then that might change conscious experience. So,
And, okay, so I think we just misunderstood. So the analogy with Sherlock Holmes would be you take two cases. In the one case, the dog was poisoned. Doesn't give you any information. In the other case, the Sherlock Holmes story, the dog could have barked but didn't bark. Okay. Now the counterpart, the experimental counterpart, is in one case my neurons don't fire because I'm looking just at a gray scene. In the other case, you're right. I intervene in the system, so causally it's not the same. Physicalism is not violated. Yet what's same in both cases, and this is counterintuitive from almost all neuroscientists, is that in both cases none of the neurons in your color area fire. And then people would say, well, of course, none of them fire. Of course, you're going to have the same experience. But in one case, as you said, you intervene in the system. It couldn't have fired, and therefore its experience is different because its cause-effect repertoire is different.
Okay, well, if you need a guinea pig, I'm signing up. But sorry, I had another question. Going back to CPUs and hardware and consciousness, I would agree that any of our simulations of the brain probably wouldn't be conscious. But conceivably, large networks of CPUs with very high bandwidth and put together in an interesting way could give you some kind of conscious process. It wouldn't be a simulation of the brain or like a human consciousness, but I suspect we have to get away from trying to give machines human consciousness and let them sort of develop their own.
Yes, you're entirely right. So particularly if you think about the internet, right, the most complex system ever built by a human.
Right.
So I don't know. It's a
Is the internet conscious?
I don't know.
Maybe now that it is Bitcoin.
I think it's a question that we can at least begin to ask now in a quantitative way.
Thanks.
Hi. So a couple questions. First of all, I would just like to say it seems like, so to actually, like when you're talking about applying this to evaluating if an animal or if a specific system is conscious, you also have to look at like every subsystem according to the theory and every supersystem in theory, right? Okay.
Yes.
Then also, I'm wondering again about the apple, if this, so you said in the case of the feed-forward net, it's not conscious because it doesn't matter to itself, the stuff that goes on inside or something along those lines?
It doesn't make a difference to itself, correct?
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you can make that more rigorous and if it has something to do with control ultimately actually as well, rather than just, or like in the sense that like, we're controlling the net and telling it what to do. We're controlling the brain simulation, telling it what to do. The person shining the light on that part of the brain is in control and not the brain as a system.
Yeah, it does ultimately relates to causality. So the feed-forward system doesn't make any causal difference to itself. It could if it were recurrently connected locally or globally, but it itself, it doesn't make any difference to itself. And that's what IT sort of, that's at the bleeding heart of IT. The ability to make a difference, the ability to cause.
But so, I mean, it's getting philosophical, but like, how do we actually evaluate causality for these like purposes then? I mean, like,
well, in this case, it's very
concrete.
concrete.
Are causing the firing in the second layer, at the instant when you do that computation, in a sense, right?
You measure it. I mean, so you can think of phi, in fact, as a measure of causal effectiveness. In a very precise sense, like Pearl, right? You can adopt, it relates to notions of Pearl's, Pearl's notion of causality, and the system that's the maximum causes is a system that will have the maximum irreducibility. So in that case, you take it from metaphysics into something, into a measure, into something you can measure.
Great, thanks. So one more thing, which is about this experiment where you have the, you're evolving the integration of these little like 11-bit mini organisms or whatever, right? So in that experiment, it seems like actually a little ill-posed to me, because before they have an integrated consciousness, I don't see much justification for treating these, individual things as individuals and like rewarding them in that way exactly.
Well, but you can, I mean, it's perfectly well determined in a computer, right? It's an algorithm, it runs, it assigns to each of these critters, it assigns, a number depending on how far made into the maze. And all I'm doing here, I'm just showing, well, the better the guys, the more adapted the guys get to this environment, the higher the integration, that's all. I mean,
okay, but just
it's perfectly well determined.
The fact that they are, I assume, being like rewarded and that their whole interface is defined on the level of this individual organism, it doesn't seem to reflect like physical reality as well to me.
I mean, I agree. It's a very simple, how much can you do with a 12-bit machine? I mean, I wish I could do more realistic, but then, we didn't have enough cloud resources to do it. It's just it's not a conceptual problem. It's a problem of realism. Yeah, it's not terribly realistic.
Well, because I mean, I would say like a counter proposal would be that you could have, actually individual agents that, and then see if they actually combine to form, super agents that then integrate and are.
I would dearly. I mean, yeah.
Okay.
More power to you if you can do it. If you can run it on a sufficiently fast hardware to compute these things in real time.
All right. Thanks a bunch.
For all 60,000 generations.
I think we better take a break because there's a new tutorial starting in 20 minutes.
Thank you very much for your attention and your consciousness.